and we'll pretty soon switch to Jenna. Jenna, are you there? There you are. I can see you.
Good morning / afternoon. It's morning here, but I know it's evening there.
Well, it's afternoon here, and we've had lunch and everything, but we also had lunch coffee.
I haven't even had my morning coffee yet.
Oh, but you seem in a good mood anyway. I wouldn't be that jolly without my morning coffee. Looking forward to hear about basic human needs like risk and fear. Speaking of moods, human moods.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna talk about discerning what things feel like, specifically, around fear and risk.
Looking forward to that.
Let me know when you're ready for me to share, and I'll go ahead and pop my slides.
Go ahead and share it any time.
Okay.
There you go. Risk of fear. Drives your test.
All right.
Okay, feel free. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna Charlton, also known as They Wrestle Test, if you are a Twitter follower. Just a little bit about me before we get started. So this talk is called Risk or Fear, and we're going to kind of ask the question, what drives your testing? What is your decision maker? And we're specifically going to talk about kind of staying the course in risk-based testing. Lots and lots of people talk about getting started. Getting started is great, but we've also got to think about maintaining once we've started. So a little bit about me. Testing is my jam. I love testing. I've been testing for over 10 years. I've lost count, so I just say decade plus at this point. I've taken a sidestep. I am now a product owner for a company called Functionize, but Functionize is a software testing tool. So while I'm a product owner, I'm still very much in the quality space. I still get to test, and now I also get to advocate for what testers need and building the right things. So it's been a really cool transition, and I've only been doing it for like a month and a half now. So still learning the job. I'm a cat parent. I always tell people that because they sometimes make appearances. I love pro wrestling. I love punk rock. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm really into web accessibility. It's something I care deeply about, is making the web accessible, or computing in general accessible for disabled people, especially because I am one since I'm ADHD. So I care deeply about this. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. Quick refresher on risk-based testing for those who either haven't done it or haven't done it in a long time. Traditionally, if you look at ISTQB, if you look at BBST and all of those organizations, they use 2 components for risk. I actually use 3, and it's really important that we use 3 for this talk because it sets the stage for the quote unquote case study that we'll talk about later. So when we think about risk-based testing, we're looking at, in this case, 3 components. We're looking at the history, also called likelihood or probability, but I prefer the word history. When we think about history, we're thinking about how often does this break? Do we have historical knowledge about this that impacts our risk-based decision-making around this particular feature, functionality, item that we're testing? We also need to think about, and this is the component that others don't use, the complexity. I really, really like using complexity. And I like this because we may have built something new. So we don't have historical knowledge. What we do have is a knowledge of the complexity of that code that's been developed. And complexity can go deeper than that. Complexity could be code-based. We could be thinking about the amount of integrations there are. We could be thinking about the complexity of the business rules or the amount of use cases around this particular feature functionality. So I really, really like complexity because something could be complex and therefore be riskier, but also have a really solid history. We still got to consider that complexity because every time we send somebody in to make a change to something that's complex, we've got a higher chance that it's going to break. Then I like to think about the customer impact. That's why I have the little bomb there, because this is when things explode. And when I think about impact, it's not just customer. I think about the user impact. I think about the business impact. I think about the impact to our brand. We can have defects that are very, very minor that can have a huge business impact. I like to use an example of something that happened to me. I got a bill from my credit card company. You may have seen me post about this on Twitter. I paid off the card and I had accidentally overpaid it by like $1.42. So it had a negative forward balance. Their system didn't recognize that a negative balance wasn't actually money owed by me. And because I didn't make a payment the next month because I had no balance, I was sent another bill with a late fee and saying that I was behind by $5, even though they owed me money back. It took a really long time to resolve that. And when I tried to make a payment just to make sure it didn't affect my credit, their system rejected the payment because I didn't owe any money. So we really have to think about the impact. It was a minor defect, really not critical, but for me, this was critical. As a user, potentially if I had made it noisier to their brand, that impact could have been huge. So we have to think about that. We have to think about the brand. We have to think about the user. We have to think about the business. We have to think about the legal potential ramifications of a defect, things like that. And when we combine these different elements of risk, these different factors and components of risk, we get our total risk. And I like to kind of use scales to represent that because it's a balance. And risk is all about a balancing game. Now, there are lots and lots of different ways to kind of measure and evaluate your risk. Some people like to use heat maps. Some people like to use emojis or other kind of team vocabulary. Those are fine. I don't love heat maps just in general because there are some accessibility issues there. Those gradients are hard for people who are colorblind. Also, there's a lot of context missed. I can't tell you the difference between orangish red and reddish orange in level of risk. Yes, I can look at it in the spectrum, but there's still a judgment call that has to be made there. So personally, I like numbers. Numbers can be tracked over time. Emojis, heat maps, things like that can't. And numbers have an inherent weight and an inherent meaning. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, well, these numbers don't add up. And you're right, they don't. But they do when we apply the right calculation. I have a blog post out about this, by the way. I'll share a link to my blog at the end that kind of is a reminder on this in case you want to go back and look at it later. So since most people who talk about risk use just two factors, I do that as well, but I do it in a different way. So here we've evaluated our history as a 5, our complexity is a 4, and our impact is a 5. What I do is I take either the history or the complexity, whichever is higher, multiply it times my impact, and that gives me my total risk of 25. So in this case, we've got 5 times 5 gives us 25. If history was a 3 and complexity was a 4, and our impact was still a 5, we would have a 20 there for risk instead of a 25. So that's kind of the math that I use here. By the way, you don't have to use this calculation. I taught a workshop on this, on doing risk evaluation, and the group that I worked with decided they wanted to use all 3 factors. You can do that. You just get a much, much broader scale. For me, the scale of 1 to 25 is nice. We wind up at a scale of 1 to 25 because I score between 1 and 5. So 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest for each factor. That gives us a max of 25, the lowest of 1. You can definitely make the scale broader, but I think that it starts to get a little bit out of control the broader we make it. So who do we include in this evaluation when we decide what the level of risk is? Well, we kind of include everybody. I used to say, oh, well, you only talk to these people and these people and these people. And I've thrown that away because I've realized, especially moving into the product ownership role and doing some consulting before this, there are people who have thoughts around the risk associated with things in your application that I would have never thought to speak with. So we want to talk to the business. We want to get the input of the testers. We want the input of UX because they're going to have insight that we may not have around experience, although testers are pretty good advocates of user experience. We may need to get the insight of our customers and our users, and we may need to get the insight of kind of specialists, performance engineers, security engineers. We may need the insight from legal. around things that have a legal implication. So we include all of these folks in our evaluation. Now, there are lots and lots of ways to do risk evaluation. I'm not going to get into those. Just know that these are all folks that you may want at the table when you are making an evaluation around risk. So let's make a quick transition. I've kind of given you a little bit of background in risk-based testing, a refresher for those who haven't done it in a while. But I really want to talk about what it really means to do risk-based testing, because that's the foundation of this. Risk-based testing is ultimately about this idea of good enough quality. We are thinking about what is good enough for our users. And when I say what's good enough, I'm not saying, well, it's good enough, throw it at them and see what they do. It's more like, I acknowledge that there could be failures here. There could be defects, there could be problems. However, we found the most critical, we found the most impactful, and we feel confident that this is good enough for our users to be able to accomplish whatever task it is that they need to accomplish in our software. At the same time, we also acknowledge the perfectionism myth, that there is no such thing as perfect software. And because there's no such thing as perfect software, and we acknowledge that inherently bugs are a part of building code, there hasn't been perfect software in who knows how long. I don't really think ever, even though theoretically you could get there with really trivial applications. We're looking to reach done. MVP isn't perfect. MVP is a finish line. And there's a huge difference between a finish line and perfection. So I really, really like to stick with the mantra that done is better than perfect. We're going for good enough quality. We're going for MVP, and that we are going to do everything we can to build solid software that works, that's functional, but with an eye towards there's a defect somewhere, and when it comes up, we're going to address it. So I want you to take a second. And I want you to think about, I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to think about this. What are you afraid of when you're testing software? And you might be saying afraid of, I'm not afraid of anything. But really, we all have some fears. Your fears might be around being blamed, being wrong, being held accountable for something that's not in your control. I want to just give you 30 seconds to think about those gut reactions to the idea of maybe applying less test coverage to something because it's lower risk, or your feelings around maybe releasing something to production that you didn't touch in regression. So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to think about that. And I want you to keep it in the back of your mind as we talk. Okay, so I've given you some time to think about that. Now I want you to keep what you thought about in the back of your mind as we think about this idea of really discerning our motivations when we test. And this really is a discernment, because fear is this icky, gross feeling in the pit of our stomachs. Fear is the kind of fight or flight stuff that pops up that makes you say, ooh, I don't feel good about this. I want to run. I want to run away from this, or I want to like fight it. I want to do everything I can to battle against the chance that this is going to be wrong. I am afraid of clowns. I know that sounds silly, but really and truly, they make me very uncomfortable. I don't like it. I don't like them at all. But I can tell you the difference between that feeling in the pit of my stomach of what it feels like when I'm face to face with a clown and I'm like, I don't like you, and the feeling that I have when I think about risk. Risk doesn't give me that icky in the pit of my stomach feeling. It instead is something that's very cerebral. I'm able to really pause and think through it. So fear has a feeling. Risk, on the other hand, is something that we can quantify. It's something that we can define. So when you identify something as a risk in your software, when you evaluate that risk and you consider it and you think about, I think that this is really a 4, this component, the history here is a 4, because I've seen defects in every regression cycle for the past 3 regression cycles. I think that the customer impact here is really low, though. You know, it's minor, it's around help text, it's pretty trivial. I feel really good about saying that this is a risk score of 8, because I can define what its impact is, I can define what its history is, I can define what its complexity is, and I can quantify it. And more than I can quantify it and I can define it, it'll hold up to scrutiny. I can very clearly say, I believe that this is why this risk score is this. This is why I feel this is a risk for X, Y, and Z reason. And this is critical here, because our risks need to be able to hold up to scrutiny. We may never agree, and you may go talk to somebody else. You may not be the decision maker on the level of coverage that you're going to apply based on risk. But when you say to somebody, I believe X, Y, and Z, it should hold up to scrutiny as you talk to them about their feelings on risk. And that's the difference there. Fear is irrational. Fear doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Now, there can be very real bases for our fear. Bases, basi, I can never say it right. But anyway, there can be a very real basis for our fear. But it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It's still irrational. There are very real bases for our risks. And that's what we need to focus on. So I want you to keep everything that we've just talked about in the back of your mind as we move into this idea of a case study. Now, I'm going to be honest, this case study is not a true case study. I didn't use a scientific method. This is based on a project I worked on. Little bit of background. At one point in my career, I worked for Progressive Insurance. That's where that 3 components of risk coming up, creating the total risk score came from. I give them total credit for that, even though I really like it, and I've totally shamelessly stolen it and use it all the time now. So this case study comes from working on a project with them. Little bit of background. What the project team I was working on did was rebuild an application, a replacement application for an agency quoting application. So this was for independent agents that sold Progressive insurance along with other insurances. And basically the goal here is to build the app that's the most usable for them, so they are more likely to go in and quote Progressive over somebody else. There's always an agenda, right? That was the agenda for this team. This was a huge project. It was estimated at like 1.5 million labor hours. It came in far above that for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the project team. Because this was such a big project and it had between 100 to 150 people working on it at any given time, we split it into 2 pieces. So first piece was the auto team. The auto team covered anything that was related to having a motor in it. Cars and what were called toys. Toys were things like motorcycles and ATVs and motorhomes and travel trailers and boats and all that kind of stuff. The auto part of the project was the larger part of the project. There were around 100 people that were working on that. And that 100-person group was then split into smaller scrum squads. Think of this as like the LESS model. The test lead, because all names have been changed to protect the innocent, we're going to call Ronnie. Ronnie was really, really committed to risk-based testing. Ronnie 100% used the evaluation that the team did around risk. And that risk was tracked in something that was called the test strategy workbook. Ronnie used that to guide testing and used that to make decisions around test coverage, because of course, the lower risk something is, the less coverage we applied to it. On the other side of the project, we had the home team. The home team had around 20 people working on it, and the home team did anything related to property. So homeowners insurance, renters insurance, weird insurances like builder's risk, which covers you when you're building a home because nobody lives there yet, but you got all sorts of money invested in it. So that test lead, we're going to call Maddie. And Maddie wasn't as into the idea of risk-based testing. She was still adjusting to it. She hadn't quite gotten to this point yet. So she didn't really use the evaluation that was done, that was documented in the test strategy workbook. She worked much more from a place of being more reactive. So it was very much based on how she felt about various components, various things that were being done. And that meant that test coverage was applied very differently than the very structured way that the auto team is applying it. There isn't a right or wrong here, by the way. This is not a judgment. This is just comparing kind of what happened in the two teams. Risk-based testing, by the way, was a long established strategy for the organization. So this wasn't new to folks that were working on this project. It's really hard to find things that are kind of apples to apples comparisons when we're talking about the difference between auto and home in insurance. However, there was something that overlapped, and that's this idea of bill plans. You might be saying, well, what the heck is a bill plan? It's basically just how your insurance company bills you or your credit card company bills you. Anyone who sends you a bill, they have a bill plan that tells them how to generate that bill. So that was one of the risk areas. For the auto team, they had scored this at a 20. They had it as the history being relatively low, but the impact being relatively high. And if you remember, since the way that math works out, our risk scores are 25 to 1, and mathematically, our highest risk scores would be 25, 20, 16, and below. But because 1 to 5 and the way those components work out, mathematically, it's 25, 20, 16. So auto team had scored at a 20. Bill plans for the auto team were fairly complex. It required data from 3 systems external to the system that was being built. Each of those systems returned a score. Those scores were used together to do a calculation. Based on what calculation result came out of that, there were 65 potential bill plans and 12 would be offered based on that score. And those 12 could be anything between pay in full yearly to pay quarterly by credit card to pay monthly by EFT. Each of those different results would result in a different premium. So that's the way the auto team worked. This was a very, very complex, very difficult to test sort of thing. And I can't go too deep into it because I have an NDA and, you know, all that kind of stuff, but I'm allowed to talk about it at kind of an abstract level. The home team, on the other hand, things were a little bit more straightforward. They had scored their bill plans at a 25. They got data from one external system. It was an API call out to this external system. It returned 3 bill plans. And that there was no calculation or anything done. It was just, here are your 3 options. And they were pay in full by check, pay in full by credit card, and pay monthly by escrow. Those were your choices. So very, very different kind of work that needed to be done and very, very different levels of complexity. And since what the home team was doing was brand new, they didn't have history. The auto team had a lot of history. Here's why this matters. This project went on for long after I left. I was there for 3 years. I was on the project for 2 years. It went on for another 3 years after I left. And so it was 5 or 6 years total. About a year and a half into this project, I started really bugging Ronnie because he was my lead. And I said, Ronnie, you know, something feels wrong here. I was like, we haven't adjusted our risk scores since we evaluated them over a year ago. Yes, we've added more risk to our system, but I feel like we're not applying test coverage correctly. I really feel like some of the things that we've scored higher risk aren't as high as risk as we originally scored them anymore. We've mitigated the risks. And I also kind of feel like there are some things that are a higher risk than they're scored. We've learned more about them. And he kept saying to me, no, we don't have time for this. We're too busy. We'll do it later. We don't have time to do this risk reassessment like you want to do. And I argued and I argued and I argued. And finally, one day I said, you know, Ronnie, you keep saying we don't have time, but what if we did this and we found more time? What if we did this and we reassessed our risk and we took just a couple of days to work together to do some assessment and realize that we're applying test coverage wrong and we could find more time in our day-to-day and we could do less regression. And I don't know if finally I'd found the right argument or if I'd just beaten him down so much that he gave in. But for whatever reason, he gave in. And he said, okay, fine, let's do it. So before this reassessment, just as a reminder, auto team was at a 20 for build plans. Home team was at a 25 for build plans. After we reevaluated the risks, the auto team said, you know, this build plan stuff is way harder than we thought it was. There are a lot of issues here and it takes us a lot of time to do regression on it. And it's way, way, way more complex than we realized. And we can't automate this because of the way these systems work. So we're going to up the score to a 25. The home team, on the other hand, said, you know, this really isn't that difficult to do. It's not that risky. Also, if for whatever reason we don't get returned those 3 build plans from this external system, those agents can actually just call a number that was listed to reach out to the other organization that handled this other side of property that was being merged into the company, whole other conversation, and they can get that premium with no problem. So we're going to drop the score down to a 12. They went from a 25 to a 12. Auto said, you know what, we learned some lessons. They went from a 20 to a 25. I was really excited to see the score go up because it meant we learned lessons from it. I was really excited to see the score go down because it meant we learned lessons from it. And in the case of home team, the risk had been mitigated. There was a workaround. We learned lessons. This was a good thing. So before going into this reassessment, now I will tell you these numbers don't add up between this slide and the next because more risks were added as we continue to develop this application. Just something to keep in mind. There were 14 items at a risk score of 25. That means that almost 40% of the risks were listed as highest risk. It's a lot of things to say are highest risk in your project. 16 things were at a score of 20 and 6 things were at a score of 16. There was nothing scored below a 16 at the original risk evaluation. If you think about those being the 3 highest potential risk scores, this really means everything requires regression all of the time, right? After before we get there, I just want you to think about what this looks like kind of mapped out on a chart. And the reason I like to look at this is because it's really important to compare this against post-evaluation. So keep this in mind, the way this works out. Because there was nothing below a 16, I don't really extend it out any further. Post-reevaluation. We've dropped from all of those things were a risk score at 25 to 7. 7 things now are at highest risk. And we finally have things that are at a risk score of 12 or below, which is great because these are the things that we start reducing test coverage on. These are the things that we say, we're going to let automation handle this. And if automation finds something, we'll go back and take a look at it. But for the most part, we're going to say, nope, automation's going to handle this. We're not going to touch it in regression cycles. This gives us flexibility. This gives us the opportunity to make decisions around where test coverage should be applied. This is what the reevaluation looks like if we chart it out. Now, it should make this nice kind of even curve, but because 16 had this weird little dip, it doesn't make the nice even curve. You know, sometimes the data doesn't come out as pretty as you want it to, but you still kind of get the idea here. We've got way less things in the highest risk, less things in moderately high risk, and we've got a whole lot more things identified as low risk. But this is where the real impact comes in, is the comparison from old to new. Old being that yellow orangish line, new being the blue line. I can't give you exact numbers, again, NDA. What I can tell you is that this is a difference in level of effort of essentially 2 full testers a week. Now, that doesn't mean that we got rid of those 2 testers. It means that people could go back to doing high impact work. Testers had time to go back to doing really meaningful exploratory testing. There was a tester that wanted to learn automation, a manual tester that wanted to learn automation. Now they have time to work with the automation team because they're not doing endless regression cycles. There was a tester that wanted to learn more about being a BA. They got to pair with the BAs because there was more time to let them do that. and quality went up. When we reduced coverage in the things that really were low risk, we could focus coverage where it mattered. And so the quality of the application grew and grew and grew because we were applying coverage in the right way to the right things. And this is ultimately, when we really, really think about this, this is about saying, I'm going to put my human capital to work where it matters the most. So I get really excited when I see this slide, and I know I have the personal experience with it, but I hope this excites you as well, because this is the difference between testing everything and testing what matters. And of course, the more automation you have, the more flexibility you have to make a decision around, where do I apply that human capital? Where do I have people touch this versus having the computer touch this? So when we break down this data, we had 4 items that increased in risk score by at least 4 points. I actually love that. We learned lessons. There's a reason we do things like retrospectives. We learn lessons from what we've experienced. We take those lessons and we put them to use. In this case, we learned these things were riskier than we thought. We learned those lessons, we put it to use. 13 items decreased in score by at least 10 points. This is 13 things that went from highest or moderately high risk to low risk. That is a huge difference in the way test coverage is applied. And then we had 10 items that were highest risk, decrease in score. So 10 things that we said, these were really risky when we started, and they're not anymore. Now we've mitigated the risk. We can focus on the other things that matters. So I get really excited when I see this. So putting these pieces together, the fear is a lie. When you have fears around reducing test coverage, around what's risky and what's not, it's lying to you. Focus on what risk looks like versus what the fear feels like. Done is the goal. We're always looking to hit that MVP. Perfection isn't going to happen. Perfection is a myth. We're looking for done. And finally, revisit your risks. My personal preference is every 3 to 6 months. 6 months is really pushing it for me. Anything less than 3 months, we probably haven't learned enough yet. Anything higher than 6 months, we've probably forgotten quite a bit. So my sweet spot really is 3 months, but I also have the memory of a grapefruit. So 3 months is even pushing it for me in my memory. But really, we want to revisit our risks, reassess them. I suggest actually doing a reassessment scheduled every couple of months, but every team that handles that a little bit differently. So I really, really appreciate you all taking some time to listen to me ramble about risk for a little while. And I'd love to open it up to questions if anybody has any.
Thank you very much, Jenna. That was really insightful.
Oh,
I haven't really thought about the difference between fear and risk before, because I've connected them very much in the past. Although I realized at one point, at one organization I was working for, I was asked to give every day I fill in a confidence level. How confident are you in achieving final date? How confident are you in QA staffing? How confident are you in development? And things like that. And that I really liked it because it was future oriented. If just looking at historical numbers is not going to help you at all, because you know the stuff that's not being shown in the historical data. So I really think this is a good approach. I thought a lot about what my fears are. You gave me 30 seconds, but I kind of missed out on the first sentence you said, because I had to completely analyze myself, and I'll probably leave it to later when tonight when I'm trying to sleep. I'll still ask myself, what are my fears? I think really nice. Who came out best of the teams?
So in the end, the auto team, which was much more effective at really applying test coverage. I'm not going to say that that was exclusively because of the risk-based approach. Maddie, it was her first at bat as a test lead. She had a lot of things to learn. And when you have more people, ultimately, you're going to have a little bit more effectiveness because there's just more hands. When you've got 20 people, people take vacation, knowledge just gets siloed in those smaller groups. So there were a lot of things working against them. However, I do think that the auto team was much more effective at really discerning where coverage should be applied. And because of that, the auto team was much more effective at strategically making decisions around automation.
Yep.
Because they became a very good, well-oiled machine when it came to identifying risk after I gave them that little kick to start reassessing. Unfortunately,
yes, because uncertainty is a risk too, or at least in some ways connected to risk. So you probably grade things higher just because of uncertainty.
Yeah.
So it's good to redo it. Really good point. I've been at times grading test cases from value and effort, and I think it's a backward way of thinking about risk and fears, but it must be connected somehow. Did you take the time to grade your test cases too?
So they didn't, and there's a really specific reason. That's because they didn't write test cases until something was like established as actually in the application. So they did almost exclusively exploratory, but they were doing exploratory regression even. So they would create charters, and the way, because of the matrix structure of management, the way things were evaluated for that didn't really go to Ronnie. It went to somebody's manager because Ronnie wasn't their manager. So they weren't graded, but the project as a whole did get kind of graded as far as what the quality levels were, because there were audits, because we're talking about insurance. So, sorts of legal stuff. And I think IT governance had something to do with that as well. Because I was just a tester on this project, I didn't get to see all of that behind the scenes stuff. I didn't see it until I actually took on the test lead role for a different project. And because it had a very different impact for the organization, it was all security oriented. We were evaluated very, very differently by a different team.
I see. Okay.
I don't know.
Compliance can do things with your risks as well.
Very different way. All totally new things I was thinking about when I took that role as a test lead for that project, because I had never really thought about security before.
No, and it kind of triggered me a little bit when you said I like heat maps. And I got a perception that you find them incomplete, and of course they're incomplete, they're models, but you had better ways of finding it. So I'm going to explore that too. I need to do that.
Are useful in specific situations, but I think if we want to track knowledge over time and track the history, a heat map doesn't help us do that very well. And when you talk about, so there are accessibility issues with heat maps, like I mentioned color blindness, but you also have people like me who struggle with kind of executive processing and things like that. So for me, when I look at something that requires spatial reasoning, and a heat map actually requires some amount of spatial reasoning, it loses context. My brain just doesn't know what to do with it, and it sees everything instead of just what I'm looking at. But for somebody who's not neurodivergent, it's probably a whole lot easier to look at.
I'm colorblind. I respect what you're saying.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? And we thank you, Jenna, for attending this conference. I hope to see you again here soon. And we'll be having a really short break before going into the last session of this track. And feel free to take your morning coffee now.
Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.
And have a really good day. Thank you very much. Okay, everybody. Well, let's meet up again in 5 minutes.